Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead, and with us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be talking about the topic on pelleted versus texturized calf starter digestibility and ruminal effects. So, welcome, Al. Thanks for joining us here today.
It's good to be back again this month.
Yeah, and before we get started, if anyone has any questions for Al, feel free to post those there in the chat. If you're joining us from social media, you can post those directly in your social channels. So Al, give us the lowdown on what this research is that you're going to be discussing today.
Well, believe it or not, this is something I overlooked about 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't even notice it until I saw an article in a dairy magazine, and this professor was quoted, and I sent him an email and said, "Where'd you get that?" And he said, "Well, here it is." And there was a couple papers, and I thought, "Wow, I missed those," because they were about one of my favorite subjects is pelleted versus texturized. And as many of you would know, I and calves prefer texturized calf starters, but it's a challenge to do that many times. And I've addressed that in my book with about 25 pages. So you can look at that in more detail than we'll cover here. So we're not going to get into that right now. But this research was done at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And it was done with 10 ruminally cannulated Holstein bull calves. Now, that's highly unusual because it's difficult to handle that with very young animals. And then, as they grow, you may have to replace the rumen cannula with a larger size. So these were local calves, and they received colostrum and so on. And that's all detailed in the papers. They also were fed a milk replacer, 22 protein, 20% fat at 2 quarts twice a day. So, a more traditional lower level of feeding. And they did that for 6 weeks, and then they cut that in half for a week. Then they fully weaned them at the end of 8 weeks. But the study, of course, goes longer than that. And we'll see that as we get into that. So let's look at first the table one, the calf starter composition, because that, of course, was the key to this particular study. Now, they also did some measurements of digestibility. So they had calf hutches and super hutches that didn't have bedding access, so that the calves wouldn't eat the bedding and confound the measurements, and they could scrape the feces and do their measurements too. But if we look at the two treatments they had, pelleted and texturized, there was about almost half of the pelleted starter was ground gel corn. And in the texturized, there was 37% whole corn, that's less. But the pelleted also had 5% extruded corn. So with those two levels, you have over about 55% of it ground corn. And that's going to be a high level of starch, as we'll see, soybean meal, and then they also ground oats, which has some starch. Whereas the texturized starter had 37% corn, whole, and 10% whole oats. Now that adds up to 47%. Now that's on the lower level, but that should be adequate in itself for texture for a calf starter. And I reference a meta-analysis I was involved with Martiza Goffery a couple of years ago that you can look at the various studies we evaluated with, and we said that you should have a minimum of about 45% texture. Now, when you look at the protein levels, it's interesting because the protein level of the pelleted was 21.7, whereas the texturized one, it was 19.5. That's about 2 units of protein. So that's about a 10% difference. And that could be a factor. And that's because when protein and amino acids are deaminated in the rumen by bacteria, it takes the amino group off the amino acid and it goes into the acid environment in the rumen. And then amino group picks up 2 hydrogen ions and becomes ammonium. And when it does that, it either prevents the pH from going lower or may even raise it. And in classic urea toxicity, it is ammonia toxicity when that happens rapidly and raises the pH above 7, and then the ammonium is rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream and can kill the animals. So there can be a factor, a beneficial factor from overfeeding protein, and that can have like a buffering effect in the rumen. And so I don't know why that ended up that way, but sometimes the formulation doesn't work out the way you want it to do. Now, if you look at the other factor that's quite different between the two, it's NDF. And you notice it's 25% in texturized versus 15 for the pelleted. And that's because if you look up above, the texturized has 12.3% cottonseed hull pellets. And I think they did that in order to create even more texture, but they didn't really need to, I don't think, in hindsight. But that's why the NDF and ADF is much higher in the texturized starter. And you see that the starch was about 43% on the pelleted and only 35% on texturized. Starch is less of a factor when you have it well texturized, because then the calves are ruminating and chewing, producing saliva, which is swallowed and buffers the rumen. So it's not as big a factor when it's texturized. Now, if you lower the starch in a pelleted starter, then you may not have enough fermentation, which helps the development of a rumen papillae. So that's kind of a critique of the two different calf starters. Now, if we look at figure 1A, and I will want to thank Matt Atkins from University of Wisconsin, or actually at USDA, and graduate student then Sonia Gelsinger, now Sonia Arnold, who provided me with the data to graph this figure, and then the other figures they also provided. So if we look at that figure, you see there's pairs of lines. The top two lines are the dry matter intake of the pelleted and the texturized. So you can see that over the period of 15 weeks of this study, that there was a clear advantage for the level of intake of the texturized, the red line, versus the blue line. There's a big gap. If anything, it gets a bit wider till towards the end, and then it narrows a little bit. And so as a result of that, as you might expect, when you look at some of the other factors, they're going to follow the same picture, but not for NDF, because remember, the texturized had the pelleted cottonseed hulls, and that elevates the NDF. And also on protein or nitrogen intake, it was higher for the texturized, even though it had a lower percent protein, because the calves ate more of it. And this is an amount, not a percentage, reflected in this graph. So we see the benefit of the texturized all through that data in this graph. Now, if we look at the following graph, and before we get into that, I just want to comment, I didn't show the data, but the pelleted calf starter had greater digestibilities of dry matter, NDF, starch, and nitrogen digestibilities across the periods. And at first glance, you might say, well, why would that be? It's primarily because of the pelleted cottonseed hulls, which had a lower NDF digestibility. Otherwise, the other digestibilities were greater for the texturized starter. So now if we look at this figure 1, the rumen pH over time, you see it starts out fairly low, about 5.3, but it's a bit higher for the texturized than the pelleted, especially after you get out there where they're eating more at 4 to 5 weeks or so. And there's a couple reasons that we should talk about this for a minute, because a lot of people who are familiar with cow data say, well, you know, the pH should be about 6 or higher. Well, that's true. And they see pHs, rumen pHs of young calves before they're weaned, that are in the low 5s, and they're thinking they're into acidosis. Well, the cow would certainly be in acidosis, and the calf is in marginal acidosis. But keep in mind that there's not that much going on in the rumen at that time. And as the calves get closer to weaning, 2 months old, the rumen pH increases. And I think the reason why is because there's not a resident protozoa population. And I've discussed it with others, such as Jeff Perkins at Ohio State, and I think he concludes that that's probably the same factor involved here. Now, the reason why the pH is lower when protozoa are absent is because protozoa do two things. They engulf starch, so that takes it out of the fermentation pool, at least temporarily. And they also have a high deaminase activity. So that means it's knocking off the amino group of amino acids and dumping it into the acid rumen, which becomes ammonium, and that helps keep the pH from going lower, or it can actually raise it a bit above normal. So without the protozoa there, in cows and sheep, studies have shown the same thing. You're going to have a lower rumen pH and be in the kind of marginal acidosis range. So that's why we see that the pH over the time period goes higher, gets to the upper 5s with these calves, and but still notice that the pelleted starter has a lower pH even as the time goes on, because they are really acidotic. They have no particle size to stimulate rumination. Now, if we look at the following figure, that's 2. That's calf starter intake. You see that at about 2 to 3 weeks, and they started feeding starter at 1 week of age. At 2 to 3 weeks, there's already a difference, and that the texturized starter is being consumed at a higher level than the other one. Now, that difference increases. And remember, these calves were weaned at 8 weeks of age. So at 8 weeks of age, beyond that difference in starter intake widens even further, because the calves are eating more, and when they're eating more of the pelleted, it creates more ruminal acidosis, and so that difference is even further widened, as you can see in this graph. Now, if we look at the figure 3, calf body weights, not surprisingly, as we see these calves eat more starter, the texturized starter, you're going to expect they're going to gain more, and that's precisely what happens. It's almost identical to the starter intake, in that it shows up at 2 weeks of age, and it widens, and it keeps widening all the way out to 15 weeks in this particular study. So that shows how the form of the starter, the texturized versus the pelleted, has an advantage for increasing intake, increasing daily gain, and it's because it does not have as low a rumen pH as the pelleted starter. So now let's kind of look at a couple areas of comments after figure 3. This study I thought was a little bit confounded, and that's not necessarily a negative comment, but just realistically, because it had pelleted cottonseed hulls. And as I said, with 47, what was it? They had 30, let me see here. We had 37% of whole shelled corn and 10% oats. So a total of 47% texture. That's on the low end. And so they may not have needed the pelleted cottonseed hull to help prevent the rumination issue, the rumen pH issue, as you saw in the pelleted. But when that was included, there's very little nutrition involved in cottonseed hulls. So that kind of confounded the results when you looked at the digestibility of the NDF and the amount of NDF, and I don't think that they would have had to do that. Now, starch was 43% in the pelleted starter. So that's not unusual for a pelleted starter. But with that much starch in a pelleted starter, you have to feed some forage with it, 5%, no more than 10%, or else you're going to have acidosis. And as I said earlier, if you lower the starch in the pelleted starter, you're not going to have as much fermentation and potential for rumen development. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. The other thing I don't understand is why dairy farmers would want to feed a pelleted starter. Yes, it costs less than a texturized starter, but then you're going to have to access some source of roughage, store it, chop it, handle it, labor required to do all that. And I bet you if you sum up all those costs, it's more than if you just simply fed a well texturized starter versus pelleted. So that's how I see that situation, is that I don't think we look at the total picture. Yes, the pelleted starter costs less per pound or per bag or per ton. Okay. Now, there were only 10 calves for treatment, 10 calves total, 5 per treatment. But that's not necessarily a limitation of this study, because they did all these measurements. You remember the rumen cannulated. Now, if you're doing a production study, you should have about 20 per treatment. But in this case, with all the measurements they were making, they had their hands full just taking care of that. And I also want to make the comment to thank Matt Akins and Sonia Arnold for providing these figures 1, 2, and 3, and then they provide me the data that I graphed, what I labeled as figure 1A. So that's the essence of this particular study.
Very good. If you have any questions for Dr. Kertz, feel free to post those now. Also, his column is posted there in the chat, so you can take a look at that, and you can read the column in the May edition of Feedstuffs. So Dr. Kertz, as we always like to do as you wrap these up, what would you say is your bottom line in all of this?
The bottom line is calves prefer and do better on a well texturized starter, and that's why I recommend it. And the benefits are they eat more, they ruminate more, they have a higher digestibility, a higher rumen pH, and more rumen development, which puts them in better shape for the month after they've been weaned and have a good intake, because they got more rumen development to take care of that second month or the month after weaning.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your insight here today, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Kertz.
You're welcome. See you next month.
And thank you all for tuning in as well. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.